This story contains graphic and disturbing images of child abuse. I struggled to decide what images to include, which are hard for me to see too. The social and government systems that should protect children failed Adrian Jones. By publishing this video, I hope to shine a light on these possible failures. Adrian Alexander Jones was born on May 5, 2008, the fifth of 6 children born to Dana Pierce and an evil soulless man named Michael Jones. He was filled by the adults in his life, the state, and all that could have done something to save him. Michael and Pierce broke up after he started having an affair with an equally as horrible woman named Heather. In September 2011, when Adrian was 2 years old, Michael got custody of the 3 children he fathered with Pierce. Reports say that in 2012, the Kansas Department for Children and Families removed Adrian and his siblings from their biological mother's care because of neglect and lack of supervision. However, Dana claims that DCF was never in her home, never did an investigation into his safety while under her care, and that Adrian was never removed from her home. Instead, she says her mother, Judy Conway, took Adrian away from her and placed him in the care of his father and stepmother. Regardless, Judy wanted the children, but the state told her the kid's father wanted custody, and he got it. Meanwhile, Michael and Heather rented a 4-bedroom home in an isolated area set on 15 acres of land in the 5200 block of North 99th Street in Kansas City, Kansas. At the time, Heather was pregnant and the couple had 6 other children in the home, isolated under the guise of homeschooling. Their landlord, Jennifer Hovers, went inside the home after they moved in. She found it odd that there were so many surveillance cameras inside the house. She assumed it was for protection because Michael was a bail bondsman, but little did she know that the home she was renting out would soon become a house of horrors, a place where unthinkable things would occur, a place that was hell on earth for precious little innocent Adrian. His father and stepmother would endlessly torture Adrian and do things that even seasoned authorities had trouble digesting. In December of 2011, this photo was taken of Adrian by Officer Wall after Adrian reported abuse at the hands of Michael and Heather. Even in his sad-looking state, nothing was done. In 2012, Adrian's grandmother Judy and Adrian's older sister Kiki visited him at Christmas and all appeared to be okay. But when they left, they didn't know it would be the last time they would see precious Adrian alive. While under the so-called care of Heather and Michael, what he endured cannot be explained in words, but his story still deserves to be told. So I will do the best I can. Just a couple of months after his father and stepmother received custody, Adrian and his siblings told other adults about the abuse they suffered at home from their parents. The children reported that Adrian suffered the most abuse out of all the children. For example, the children said they saw lines on him and said he was choked one night while he was in the bathroom with Heather. DCF investigated and learned that Heather hit the children with objects or her hand, leaving whelps and bruises. The children said the father also used physical discipline, but it didn't seem to be as severe as the physical discipline Heather used. Michael told DCF he and Heather would split up and he would ensure that she would not have contact with the children, and a safety plan was put in place. However, that plan didn't last, and unbeknownst to DCF, the couple had reunited. DCF would only find out after a report was filed regarding Adrian not getting proper medical care for his mental health needs in August 2013. The family moved numerous times between Kansas and Missouri, making it challenging for DCF to keep up with them. But DCF in both states still received reports of abuse. Soon after moving across the state line to Missouri, someone called to report that Heather was selling meth from their house and Adrian was seen eating out of trash cans. The Kansas City Star reports that numerous people made repeated hotline calls saying he was being neglected and beaten at home by his father and stepmother. But like most of these cases, very little was done to protect the children. The family then stopped communicating with Missouri authorities and moved across the state line again back into Kansas. In 2013, a Missouri Children's Division social worker and police officer spoke with Adrian. The files released by DCF revealed the agency had extensive interactions with the family, during which Adrian disclosed the abuse to social workers. The little boy told them, "Daddy kicks me. He keeps hitting me in the head and punches me in the stomach, and Mom keeps pulling on my ears and it really hurts." He added that his parents always locked me in my room and I have to sleep without a pillow and blanket. He also said he was forced to do push-ups all day long. The Kansas City Star reported that the Missouri Children's Division found a large amount of evidence that Adrian had been neglected in July 2013. Missouri had planned to provide in-home services to the family even though the family failed to cooperate with Missouri authorities. At one point, the family tried to give Adrian to the authorities, yet they would not take him. Apparently, nothing was done about anything. Because Adrian reported the abuse and no one saved him, Michael and Heather began keeping him confined in their shower. They did this to keep him from being able to tell anyone about the abuse he was suffering. In 2014, Adrian spent a few months in a residential treatment center after being diagnosed with PTSD. Michael called Adrian's grandmother Judy and told her that Adrian was in a psychiatric hospital because he was a pedophile. Even with these outlandish lies about Adrian, he was still not removed from the care of Michael and Heather. Combining Kansas and Missouri's abuse files would eventually amount to more than 2,500 pages. I know I'm saying this a lot, but it's important. Adrian was never, not even once, removed from Michael and Heather's custody. Therefore, he endured several years of unfathomable torture, beatings, isolation, and starvation. Fast forward to November 5, 2015, Heather called the police to report domestic abuse at the hands of Michael. When the police arrived, Heather told them her husband had tried to shoot her. The house was filthy and had bullet holes in the walls. Trash was strewn throughout the house, along with dead mice, rat poison, syringes, and pornography videos on the floor and the countertops. At this point, the 7 children in the home ranged from 2 to 10 years old. But one thing was missing: Adrian. The police were very familiar with the family and were concerned when Adrian could not be found. Shockingly, Heather told them if they looked around the property, they'd find the remains of a child. Police returned the following day and found partial human remains in a livestock pen near the barn, and later identified them as belonging to Adrian. After spending most of his life severely abused, Adrian was murdered by his father and stepmother and died alone on the floor of a dirty shower after starving to death. Because he became too weak to stand up or lean against a wall, Michael and Heather strapped him to a chair and left him in the shower to die. His body remained there for 2 weeks until the smell became overwhelming. Then his parents went out and purchased pigs. They intentionally did not feed the pigs for a while to ensure they were extremely hungry. Shortly after the Joneses were arrested, the landlord said Heather gave her the passwords for her computer because she wanted her to send pictures of her children while she awaited trial in custody. The landlord had no idea she was logging into a nightmare of gruesome evidence. As soon as she opened iCloud, she found pictures of Adrian's abuse. She took the evidence to the police and then to Adrian's grandmother. The abuse began with Adrian being forced to stand for hours with his hands in the air. Several photos show the 7-year-old strapped to a table and blindfolded. Heather Jones also shared these pictures with groups of people on Facebook. She discussed and shared stories of torturing young Adrian. Heather had even saved online ads for straitjackets and blanket wraps for transporting human bodies. Photos showed his face was cracked with a broomstick. He was forced to eat out of a maggot-infested bowl outside his home with his hands tied behind his back. He was stripped naked and confined to a shower stall for hours and even strapped to an inversion table. He had been strapped to the inversion table so much that his little hands and ankles were permanently swollen. Heather even shared some pictures with her friends on Facebook, yet no one reported them. There were messages throughout Facebook talking about tossing him. Many of the photos show mysterious marks on Adrian's body. The couple even took photographs of Adrian's deteriorating health, documenting it as if they were proud of the torture they inflicted upon him. Surveillance video shows Adrian's hands and feet handcuffed while he was forced to stay outside. One video clip shows Adrian trying to use his mouth to pick up what appears to be a bowl and eat whatever is in it. At that point, his stepmother, Heather, comes into the video and seems to be lecturing Adrian. He would regularly be shocked with a stun gun for 20 seconds. During the trial, the prosecutor stayed quiet for 20 seconds to let the court realize how long that time was. In the distressing video, Adrian desperately tries to drink from a cup, but he can't pick it up because his wrists are handcuffed behind his back. Most of Adrian's last days were spent stripped naked and confined to a shower stall for hours. The Joneses also forced their son to stand in neck-deep water in the family's filthy swimming pool overnight in winter in Kansas. One video shows him being forced to hold tiki torches over his head for long periods. It looked like there were a lot of taser marks and then a lot of swelling from being strapped to the inversion table and handcuffed to the wall, and a lot of scratches and stuff from probably trying to get out. There were 32 surveillance cameras in the house to watch him. Adrian went from a healthy little boy to a skeletal one with rotten teeth and sunken eyes. Heather also documented Adrian's abuse in writing. She uploaded notes about it that date back to 2012. In the last months of Adrian's life, his parents stopped calling him by his name. Instead, they called him the boy. In a Facebook message Heather sent to an unknown person, she wrote, "Just strap the boy to my inversion table with handcuffs and ace bandages and put him downstairs." Judy said Michael and Heather wouldn't let her see the kids in the months leading up to Adrian's death. She told the 41 Action News investigators she was worried and contacted the Kansas Department for Children and Families twice. Michael was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Heather was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after less than 30 years. Heather actually had the galls to say that she wasn't strong enough to protect him and felt helpless to protect him from her abusive husband. Adrian can no longer be saved, but other children may be protected in the future if DCF reevaluates its practices and learns from the circumstances surrounding Adrian's death. Community members can contact their local legislators to request a formal review of DCF or DHS, as called in some states. My heart grieves for this little boy who had no one to protect him and only knew abuse and terror. According to the Kansas City Star, a Missouri caseworker said that she made the Kansas caseworker aware that Adrian had disclosed physical abuse by his stepmother and his father. Additionally, the worker commented that she reported the children were homeschooled and had not been seen by any outside members of the family regularly. Kansas DCF Secretary Phyllis Gilmore stated that they last had contact with the family in early 2012. KSHB.com reported that Gilmore said the family's frequently alternating residency between Kansas and Missouri greatly disrupted the continuity of services and evaluation. However, she insisted Kansas child welfare officials often shared information about Adrian when known with their Missouri counterparts. Additionally, Gilmore stated that her agency thoroughly investigated each reported incident of abuse or neglect involving Adrian. They last had contact with the family in early 2012. Which one is it? Kansas DCF refused to release any information regarding the case, something they are known for. A former employee of Michael Jones stated that he witnessed Adrian being abused but never said anything. Also, Adrian's grandmother contacted DCF twice before his murder. Former Deputy Director of DCF, Diane Keach, said she is appalled by the lack of transparency from the agency. She quit the department due to issues similar to this case. Diane stated that DCF often kept these types of child death cases secret from the public and said that the attorney for DCF didn't feel like they should document anything related to a child's death. She wanted only to have a verbal conversation over the phone. She said if we took handwritten notes, we were instructed to shred them afterward. She said she'd personally viewed numerous deaths in Kansas where they missed it. The Joneses weren't the only adults in the home. Another resident by the name of Willie Flowers was living there as well. He can be seen on camera in the house and knew what was happening, but did absolutely nothing. According to Heather, Flowers would often babysit the children. The department said they looked into Flowers after Adrian's death, but didn't have enough evidence to charge him. John Pizzerno, a criminal defense attorney, said it's not a crime to live in a home while a child is being abused or even tortured and killed. In 2017, Kansas Representative Luis Ruiz introduced Adrian's Law, which was signed into law and states adults now must report child abuse or face criminal charges. It is now a requirement that the Kansas DCF physically lay eyes on a child at risk for abuse when visiting the home. They could not just leave the house without an answer. After Adrian died, the 41 Action News investigators spoke to several people who said they contacted DCF before Adrian was killed. Adrian's grandmother also said, Adrian was often hungry and forced to eat plain oatmeal, while his 6 sisters living in the house were given McDonald's. The surveillance video from inside the home shows a very thin and naked Adrian in the kitchen getting what appears to be a bowl of water. The footage shows Adrian cowering behind a cabinet and slowly lowering himself to the ground as he notices another person entering the room. As the person passes by, Adrian can be seen carrying the bowl as he sneaks out of the room. Adrian's grandmother, Judy Conway, identified that person as Adrian's great-uncle, Willie Flowers. The landlord described the video and said it looked like Adrian had snuck out of the shower and was going to get a bowl of water, and the uncle walked in and Adrian hid and then ran out behind him. Little Adrian was doing everything he could to survive. He tried to escape, tried to get help, tried to eat, and tried to live. He was punished if he was caught trying to eat food. In one of the videos, he was seen being forced to eat from a bowl of applesauce with bugs and dirt in it while his hands were bound. Other photos show him tied up with a plate of food in front of him and a bar of soap in his mouth so that he couldn't eat the food. Alarms were even placed on cabinets so that if Adrian ever tried to get food, Heather and Michael would be notified. His ankles were bent out of shape due to the beatings and restraints. In a Facebook post on Christmas Day in 2014, Heather referenced wanting to simulate a scene in an episode of The Walking Dead where one of the characters shoots a child in the back of the head. The Kansas City Star reported that a Missouri child advocate and CEO of Foster Adopt Connect, Lori Ross, stated that Adrian should have been removed from the home by Missouri authorities after he reported abuse in 2013. Lastly, I hope everyone who sees this will share this story and never allow the child welfare system to forget what happened to young Adrian Jones. Shortly after Adrian's death, records from DCF were sealed by the state of Missouri and Kansas despite a law being in place since 2000 for that states when a child is killed or nearly killed from abuse. The files become public record. It was 2017 before the records in Adrian's file were finally released 4 years after his murder. Family members of Adrian filed a lawsuit seeking $25 million in punitive damages against social workers they say should have removed him from a dangerous situation. The lawsuit filed against social workers from the Missouri Department of Social Services and the Kansas Department for Children and Families alleged that child welfare workers knew Adrian was being physically abused but didn't remove him from his home and just documented the abuse. The lawsuit states the agencies and workers allegedly meticulously investigated and carefully documented every violent kick, punch, slap, and injury inflicted upon Adrian by his sadistic father and stepmother. The agencies allegedly generated stacks of records and reports chronicling the ceaseless stomach-churning abuse. But according to the lawsuit, an intervention was limited and consisted of having the Jones couple sign a piece of paper agreeing to stop torturing the child, the legal equivalent of a pinky swear. I know this was a very hard story for all of us to get through, but sometimes things, no matter how bad they are, still need to be shared. Let's never stop pushing for more protection for these poor innocent children. And while they didn't save Adrian, at least he is no longer suffering. Michael and Heather, I'm sure hell has a special place for you. Chase Allen was born on August 31st, 2018 into a life of hell. When he was only 2 months old, he and his siblings were taken away from their mother, Azure de France, because of abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, 3 months later, all the children were returned over the objections of their grandmother and aunts. Their continued calls to the hotline to report suspected incidents of abuse were to no avail. The children were living in a house at 12,765 Monte Vista Street in Detroit, Michigan, and with the continued abuse and neglect, they were unable to defend or care for themselves. When Chase was 3 years old, his loved ones described him as sweet, shy, and soft-spoken. His family members started noticing that he appeared malnourished and neglected by his abusive mother, France. They offered to take him in and care for him, but she refused. The family says they contacted Child Protective Services and the Detroit Police Department dozens of times, but were told there was nothing they could do. The abuse worsened and Chase ended up going blind for some strange reason. Family members even found him with burns on his body. When France was questioned about it, she told her sister and mother that he burned himself when touching a hot noodle plate. After that incident was reported, CPS was supposed to do 3-month checkups, but the family believes those follow-ups never occurred. Eventually, France told her mother that Chase had gone to live with his paternal grandfather's girlfriend in Coldwater, Michigan. But when his grandfather was released from jail, he refuted France's claim and said that Chase was not living there. France told a different story to neighbors. She said he was living in Alabama with her aunt and uncle because he needed so much care and attention after going blind. A next-door neighbor said she had never met Chase, but she often bought clothing and food for the 5 other children, whom she described as deprived. France has a history of postpartum depression, but refused treatment or therapy. CPS received a complaint that France threatened to harm one of her sons on April 7, 2020, the day after giving birth to him. France has an extensive history with Children's Protective Services. Court records indicate prior contacts with CPS 3 times in 2016 and twice in 2017 due to physical abuse, improper supervision, sexual abuse, failure to protect, and physical neglect. At the time of her 5th child's birth in 2020, her other 4 kids were in foster care due to physical abuse and France's untreated mental health. They were also in foster care in 2018 because she had pleaded guilty to severe physical abuse of her 2-year-old nephew who was temporarily in her care. The child's father, France's brother, had passed away, and the child's mother told CPS workers that she allowed the toddler to live with France for a short time because she needed a break. But she became suspicious that something was wrong when France refused to send her a picture of her son and return him. When the child got to the hospital, his lips were swollen. His left eye was black with a scratch under it, and he had a contusion on his forehead and bruises to his rib cage and ankles. France pleaded guilty to 4th-degree child abuse, a misdemeanor, and the felony charge was dismissed. She received 2 years of probation, which ended in February 2021. It's unclear why, but after France's completed probation on her criminal child abuse case, her children were returned to her. On June 24, 2022, CPS was contacted by an unknown caller for a welfare check to lay eyes on Chase. When the Detroit Police Department officers arrived at France's home, she opened the door and tried to push the officers away as if nothing was going on. The officers ignored her and went inside to find 5 other children living in squalor. A 3-month-old girl, a 2-year-old boy, a 5-year-old boy, a 7-year-old boy, and a 9-year-old girl. As France continued to talk, they recognized that something was wrong with the conversation and how she communicated with them. Suddenly, France admitted that Chase was in the basement refrigerator. Officer Matthew McKinney entered the basement, opened the freezer, and found a red, white, and blue bag. When he opened it a bit, he made a horrific discovery: Chase's decomposing body. It wasn't immediately clear when Chase died or how long he had been in the freezer. France said he had medical issues and died, so she put him in the freezer. It was later determined that he had 2 skull fractures and was malnourished. His cause of death was blunt force trauma, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. France said she kicked him in the chest, and when he wouldn't wake up the next day, she put his body in the freezer where it remained for 3 months. France admitted to abusing Chase often because she would get frustrated with him, especially after he went blind, but did not ever hitting him in the head. The other 5 children were taken to the hospital to be evaluated. Once their physical health was assessed, the children underwent kids' talk, a forensic interview with investigators and a child psychologist. They were then placed in the custody of Child Protective Services until the family took them in to care for them. France was charged with 1st-degree murder, 1st-degree child abuse, torture, and concealing a death. The medical examiner said it takes more force to fracture a child's skull than an adult's because kids have more water content in their skulls. During an interview, France admitted that she didn't want Chase, but was too scared of losing her other kids to say anything about it. She said she'd never had a blind child before and had no help caring for her children. Toni Haynes, France's mother, says she is mourning the loss of her grandson and is sickened and outraged that he died at the hands of her own child. Shockingly, media interest in this story dropped off after a few days, and amazingly, there was little to no coverage of the preliminary court hearings on the case. Even worse, there has been no response to the tragedy from the Detroit City Council, the Michigan legislature, or community activists. Unfortunately, Chase is one of many children each year in the state of Michigan that die of abuse or neglect, and in many of the cases, CPS was notified, but they failed to do anything. My name is Jacob Irvin Boyarin. My favorite food is steak. My favorite color is blue. My best friend is Dan Larson. I don't really have a favorite song. My favorite game is Clue. My favorite thing to do most is watch football. My favorite sport is football. My favorite TV show is a coffee show. What I want to be when I grow up is a football player. My favorite hobby is collecting football cards. I don't have a favorite book, and my newest bandit is Gabe. I'm finished. Jacob Irwin Wetterling was born on February 17, 1978, and was described as a sweet boy who was loved by all who knew him in the small town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. By age 11, he was in the 4th grade and was the goalie for his ice hockey team. On the morning of October 22, 1989, Jacob went fishing with his father Jerry. After fishing, they spent the rest of the day watching the Vikings game and tossing a football around in the yard. Jacob's parents would leave the home that evening to attend a dinner party. Jacob was one of 5 children that lived in the house, and since their parents were planning only to be gone for a couple of hours, Jacob was allowed to have a friend come over. His friend was Aaron Larson, and they were excited to stay up late that Sunday night because they didn't have school the next day. Once their parents arrived at the dinner party, they called and left the phone number with the kids in case of an emergency. Jacob's 10-year-old brother, Trevor, called their parents back later and asked if the 3 of them could ride their bikes and scooter to the local Tom Thumb store to rent a video about a mile or so away. Patty Wetterling told him no, but once their father got on the phone, he told them they could go as long as they brought large flashlights so traffic could see them because it was dark. Then they called again to tell them they would ask the neighbor to babysit. This was the first time Jacob was able to ride his bike after dark to the store. The 3 boys traveled along 91st Avenue Southeast, a quiet dead-end road. They arrived at the store hoping to rent the Major League movie, but it was rented out, so they settled with Naked Gun and some candy. As Jacob, his brother, and his friend Aaron were almost back from the Tom Thumb convenience store, a man with a pistol concealing his face with a stocking cap mask stopped them as they walked near the driveway to the Rassier farm. It was a little after 9 p.m. and very dark in the rural area, and their location was set back quite a ways from the road. The man told the boys to get off their bikes and scooters, toss them in the ditch, and lie face down on the ground. He then asked 10-year-old Trevor and 11-year-old Jacob and Aaron their ages. He told Jacob's brother Trevor to run toward a nearby wooded area and not look back or else he would be shot. He then demanded to view the faces of the 2 remaining boys. He picked Jacob and told Aaron to run away, threatening him like he had Trevor. But as the boys ran away, they ended up looking back to see that Jacob and the man were already gone. The boys ran back to Jacob and Trevor's home and frantically told a neighbor what had happened. At this point, they called the parents and gave them the heartbreaking news. Jacob had been kidnapped. Meanwhile, a neighbor named Kevin, who had a police scanner, heard the dispatcher's call and went straight to the scene. When he got there, authorities had not yet arrived. When a St. Joseph PD patrolman finally showed up, he told Kevin to leave the area. The officer assumed that Kevin was an onlooker, which was the case, but he was never questioned after the fact. If Kevin, the neighbor that was the first person to the scene, had been questioned initially, he could have told the investigators where he was when he heard the dispatcher, the route he took to the crime scene, and when he got there. But more importantly, he could have told them of any vehicles he passed coming from the direction of the crime scene. Then they could have determined if any reports of vehicles in the area were Kevin, and his tires could have been compared with other tire tracks on the driveway. A bloodhound led officers to tire tracks, prompting them to believe the kidnapper had a car nearby that may have driven from the nearby interstate, and this would be their focus for the next 14 years or so. The police also noticed children's footprints leading a short distance up the driveway. They seemed to have concluded that Jacob was taken to a vehicle in the driveway and driven away from there. An FBI profiler suggested the kidnapper was a white male between 25 and 35, likely a sex offender who was employed at an unskilled job and had a low self-image, probably stemming from a physical deformity such as acne or scars. For nearly 10 days, over 200 searchers scoured the area with canines, horseback, and helicopters. Finally, 5 days into the investigation, a sketch artist created an image of a man who attempted to abduct a boy in nearby Stearns County earlier that summer, and also the 1970s Ford van he was driving. At that point, all resources are directed at a search for an unknown vehicle with an abducted child. But less than 48 hours after Jacob was kidnapped, a local high school sophomore walked into the Stearns County Sheriff's office with his father and asked to meet with an investigator. The boy said that in the last year and a half to 2 years, there had been between 7 and 9 molestations in nearby Painesville. He said he personally witnessed 2 of the assaults and that someone grabbed the boys off their bikes and threatened them with a knife. The boy said the style of the attacks was similar to what happened to Jacob. He suggested that investigators talk to Officer Bill Drager at the Painesville Police Department. But Stearns County investigators didn't pursue the lead until January 5, 1990, nearly 3 months later. When they finally did, it led them straight to Danny Heinrich, a suspect in the Painesville cases. Heinrich was given a lie detector test, but failed regarding Jacob's abduction. A couple of days after Heinrich is interviewed about the Painesville assaults, Stearns County Sheriff's Detective Steve Mund photographed Sears brand tires on Heinrich's blue Ford EXP. Mund had created the plaster cast of the tire marks at the scene of Jacob's abduction and was also the investigator who on October 30th, 1989 had received an FBI crime lab report connecting the tracks to one of 2 types of Sears tires. In early 1990, investigators found only 2 sets of tire matches throughout the investigation. One was Heinrich's and the other came from a car that was broken down and hadn't been driven in a while. Though many possible suspects were ruled out based on the non-matching tires, it seems that Heinrich's tires didn't rule him in, even though he drove the only car that could be connected to the crime scene. Investigators had convinced Heinrich to stand in a lineup for 3 boys, 2 of which had reported seeing a suspicious man in a car near the Wetterling's house the week before his abduction, and a boy named Jared Shirel. Jared was a 12-year-old boy who was abducted 9 months before Jacob, 10 miles away in the nearby town of Cold Spring. Jared was walking down the street only 3 blocks from home when a car pulled up and stopped. The driver asked Jared for directions, before jumping out of the car and grabbing him by the shoulders. He forced Jared into his vehicle and threatened to shoot him. After being sexually assaulted, he was then allowed to go home as long as he ran away and never looked back. The same thing Jacob's abductor would tell Trevor and Aaron 9 months later. Heinrich was arrested for the crime and interviewed by FBI agents that didn't know he was a suspect in the Painesville assaults. Also, they were allegedly inexperienced and observed the interrogation and told detectives they didn't think Heinrich was guilty, and he was shockingly released. As for the lineup, no one picked out Heinrich, but Jared wasn't given a chance to hear the men talk so he could tell if their voices matched his abductor. Oddly, neither Trevor nor Aaron was present at the lineup, nor any of the 7 Painesville boys that were molested. In early 1991, high-ranking law enforcement investigators interviewed Dwayne Hart in prison. Hart was an early suspect in Jacob's case, a convicted sex offender from Painesville, and a longtime acquaintance of the Heinrich family. Hart told the investigators he visited Heinrich's apartment the month Jacob was kidnapped. He said he saw a handgun, 2 police scanners, and a black ninja-type suit. Also, Heinrich had asked Hart how to dispose of a body. Hart recommended wrapping it in plastic and leaving it at a sewage treatment plant. Nothing ever came of the interview, and there was reportedly no follow-up with Heinrich. Years later, it was revealed that Jacob was initially buried on Sewage Pond Road, suggesting that Heinrich took Hart's recommendation. 2 weeks after Jacob's kidnapping, a composite drawing was released of a man who was seen acting suspiciously at the same store the boys had visited that night, and a quick mark in Avon shortly before the abduction. A week after that, 2 more sketches were released, one of a man who talked about the incident and another of a man suspected of trying to kidnap a New Brighton boy. Then, nearly a month after Jacob went missing, a detailed description of a car involved in the attempted abduction of a 13-year-old boy in Roberts, Wisconsin was released. Finally, the FBI released another sketch that blended all 3 sketches together. They did this because agents believed all 3 sightings could have been the same man. Trevor and Aaron were both hypnotized and neither saw or heard a car at the abduction site. So after many years, it was thought that there was no reason a man would have come off the highway searching for children at that time of night. Instead, the kidnapper likely lived nearby, saw the boys go by and knew they would be coming back his way. Without any other core leads, investigators turned their sights on Dan Razier. Razier became a person of interest and rumors spread about his possible involvement, ruining his reputation with many in the community. With a search warrant, the Razier family farm was searched back in the summer of 2010 while Dan Razier still lived with his parents, who were now elderly, in the same house. The police took 6 truckloads of dirt away from the farm and did some other investigating. A couple of the things taken were a box of newspaper clippings about Jacob's abduction and excerpts from a journal with Dan's thoughts about the case. He lived with his parents on a farm, the one that was at the end of the driveway in the house closest to the spot where Jacob was taken. Dan also called the police to report a car turning around in his driveway that night. His parents were out of town the night Jacob was abducted and he was home alone. Nothing of evidentiary value came from that search, but he remained a person of interest. Meanwhile, Jacob's mother, Patty, became an activist and an advocate for children. After Jacob's abduction, Patty and Jerry formed the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. In 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Act was established to mandate that states register sex offenders. This was the first law to institute a state sex offender registry. In 2008, the foundation became the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. It is dedicated to spreading education and awareness about sexual predators, how it happens, who takes them, and what we can do to prevent them. The law has been amended several times, most famously by Megan's Law in 1996, and the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act in 2006. Megan's Law expanded the mandate community notification so we can now go to our iPhone apps and find out who the registered sex offenders are around us. So if you quickly search your surrounding area, you may likely be surprised at the number of registered sex offenders in your neighborhood and their addresses. Fast forward to October 28, 2015. Danny Heinrich was finally announced to be a person of interest. It turns out that several weeks after Jacob's abduction, Heinrich was questioned by the FBI, but they didn't have enough to link him to Jacob's abduction. But Heinrich's DNA was eventually connected to the kidnapping of Jared Sherrill through DNA on Jared's sweater. Shockingly, the statute of limitations had expired and they couldn't arrest or hold him accountable. Still, it was a good enough reason for them to search his house. During the search, they found child pornography and immediately arrested him. Heinrich then began cooperating with the authorities as part of an unusual plea deal. Heinrich agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of the 25 federal child pornography charges brought against him in the plea agreement. The plea agreement stated that Heinrich had to reveal the location of Jacob's body and give details of the abduction and murder. On September 1, 2016, he showed the FBI where he buried Jacob. His remains were recovered and dental records positively identified him. Heinrich confessed in court the details of what he did to Jacob. He said he was driving on that dead-end road that night when he noticed 3 boys on their bicycles with a flashlight. Heinrich says after he handcuffed Jacob and drove away, Jacob asked what he had done wrong and began crying. He then drove 30 miles to Painesville where he sexually assaulted him. He said that he was able to avoid police by listening to a police scanner. He said he heard police sirens, but they had nothing to do with him. He thought they were coming for him and got scared and panicked. He said he told Jacob to turn around and raise the revolver to Jacob's head. But the gun jammed. With Jacob still standing, Heinrich said he pulled the trigger a second time and Jacob fell to the ground. Heinrich walked back to his home and returned a couple of hours later to bury Jacob in a shallow grave. A year later, he returned and saw that the remains were partially uncovered. He could even see Jacob's jacket, so he moved the bones close to a farm across the highway where he dug a trench 2 feet deep. And that's where Jacob remained for nearly 27 years. Heinrich was only sentenced for 1 count of child pornography, which carries a maximum prison sentence of 20 years, despite confessing to abducting 2 boys, sexually assaulting them, and killing one. In January 2017, Heinrich was transferred to a federal prison in Massachusetts to serve his 20-year sentence. He is scheduled to be released on the child pornography charges in 2033 when he is 70 years old. So, Devens, Massachusetts, you'll better watch out. In 2018, Jared Sherrill was awarded $17 million in a suit against Heinrich, even though he is well aware that Heinrich has no money. Jared says he pursued a civil case against Heinrich after he was told that the criminal statute of limitations had expired in his case. Even though Jared's claims were largely ignored, He remained adamant to authorities that Jacob's kidnapper was the same man that kidnapped him. Patty Wetterling again expressed her gratitude to Jared, saying without his tireless efforts, the 27-year mystery of the kidnapping and murder of her son would never have been solved. Madison Marie Wabb was born on December 13, 1993, and went by Maddie. She lived in Reading, Pennsylvania, and graduated from Exeter High School in 2012. At the age of 23, Maddie worked as a mail sorter for Pitney Bowes. She was described as loving, always the life of the party, and adored her nieces and nephews. But she fell on hard times when she began struggling with opioid addiction turned heroin addiction over a 4-year period. On October 8, 2017, her body was tragically found wrapped in carpet on the side of Regal Road in a field near Faust Road in Lower Heidelberg Township. Her cause of death was a close-contact gunshot wound, and her thumbprint was used to identify her. A friend of Maddie's said he last saw her early in the morning on October 6th, when she left a restaurant on the 800 block of Penn Street in Reading heading towards South 8th Street. During the investigation, video surveillance was discovered that showed Maddie entering an apartment at 800 Franklin Street at 1:05 a.m. Around 1:45 a.m., a woman named Carmen and her brother Christopher Morales Feliciano were seen exiting the apartment. At 2:37 a.m., Christopher and a friend of his, Christian Carmona Lanos, returned to the apartment. A short time later, they're seen carrying a large rolled-up carpet with Maddie's arm dangling out of it, and they carried it to a waiting vehicle that had just arrived at the apartment. As the investigation continued, another witness told detectives that Carmen had admitted to shooting Maddie. They said she shot Maddie execution style and then met up with her brother Christopher and Fran Christian at a corner store to devise a plan to, as they said, throw her away. Another witness said after disposing of her body, Carmen returned to the apartment and opened the trap house to continue selling drugs. Video surveillance showed Carmen making hand-to-hand controlled substance deliveries both before and after Maddie's murder. After reviewing all of this evidence, a grand jury recommended criminal charges. Both Carmen and Christopher were already in custody on unrelated charges when the grand jury recommended charges. Christian, on the other hand, was at large and had to be tracked down and arrested. On October 11, 2017, authorities raided the apartment where Maddie was murdered. Carmen pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, corpse abuse, drug trafficking, and other charges. She was sentenced to 22.5 to 50 years in prison as agreed to in her plea deal and received credit for 768 days served. She also pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence, conspiracy, and 5 counts related to heroin and cocaine trafficking, including 3 from a separate arrest. Prosecutors never discussed whether she had a motive for the shooting. Her brother, Christopher, pleaded guilty to abuse of a corpse, criminal conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 7.5 to 25 years in state prison. The third suspect in the case, Christian, was charged with abuse of a corpse, criminal conspiracy, and tampering with physical evidence. Deborah Kathleen Tomlinson was born to parents Chaim and Dora on June 11, 1956. She went by Debbie and was outgoing, passionate about horses, and a very good student. At the age of 19, she was a student at Colorado Mesa University and lived alone in an apartment on the 1000 block of Belford Avenue in Grand Junction, Colorado. However, 2 days after Christmas in 1975, her life was sadly cut short. She was found deceased in her bathtub, having been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. Thankfully, even with it being 1975 and way before DNA was used to solve crimes, investigators collected and preserved the DNA found on her body. The primary suspect at the time was Debbie's uncle, and the officers extensively looked into him until a year later when he was cleared of all suspicion. Meanwhile, within 4 months of her murder, the case went cold until 2019 when detectives reopened it. Nobody who originally worked the case was still on the force, and so the new detectives had to start poring over old notes and interviews. Interestingly, though, each of the original detectives at the crime scene had used a different colored pen when making notes so that years later others could see their different interpretations of what they saw. In 2020, using DNA evidence, a DNA profile was created and used for genetic genealogy. As a result, Paraban was able to narrow down the possibilities before a final list of leads was produced. Those leads eventually led to suspect Jimmy Dean Duncan, but authorities couldn't collect DNA from Duncan because he died in 1987 of natural causes in his late 30s. So investigators contacted Duncan's brother, who provided his DNA instead. The DNA was a match and proved that Jimmy Dean Duncan was in fact Deborah Tomlinson's killer, officially solving the case 45 years later. At first, authorities couldn't find a connection between Duncan and Deborah, but investigators theorized that Duncan had a relative who lived near Debbie's college and they might have possibly met while he was visiting the relative. He was 26 at the time of the murder, and his criminal history showed a previous robbery and a separate shooting in Florida. Thankfully, Debbie's 82-year-old father was still alive to see his daughter's murder solved. Lauren Brittany DiMolo was born in 1990. At the age of 29, she was living in Cape Coral, Florida with her boyfriend Gabriel Pena, known as Gabby, at 4927 Coronado Parkway apartment number 1, and it's reported they had a very tumultuous relationship. Lauren didn't own a car and often walked places in the area around her apartment. On June 19, 2020, Gabby said when he left for work that morning, Lauren was still sleeping. When Gabby returned from work that day, Lauren was gone, but her cell phone was still in the apartment and she never left home without it. So, he called Lauren's father Paul later that night to tell him he was concerned, and this was the first time he had ever called Paul. Her father didn't become very concerned until the next day. Strangely, Gabby didn't spend the next night in the apartment, but instead he stayed with a friend. Another day passed, and when her father, who lived out of state, checked back in with Gabby for updates, he said there was still no sign of Lauren and that he had contacted the police, but they never showed up for a report. So, Paul contacted the Cape Coral police and they said that they never got a call about a missing person. So Gabby then admitted that he never filed the report. But he told Paul that he would go actually file one that day on June 21st. At this point, it had been 2 days since she was last seen, and Paul starts to become more suspicious of Gabby being involved in his daughter's disappearance because just weeks earlier, Lauren confided in him that Gabby had physically assaulted her. The day before she went missing, she was released from her second involuntary psychiatric hold that month because she had been experiencing psychosis with paranoia and auditory hallucinations. She had to stay longer than 72 hours because she harmed herself during that time because voices in her head were telling her to hurt herself in order to save the world. The first time she was put in psychiatric hold was after she jumped into the Bimini Basin and began swimming towards Four Freedoms Park, where swimming is not allowed because she thought someone was after her. Once police arrived, she jumped back in the water, but once she got out of the water, she was talking about aliens and voices in her head. Once released, she was prescribed an antipsychotic. It was never picked up. She was known to use drugs in the past, which is why she had lost custody of her young daughter, Michaela. Her family believed that she had been clean for 2 years besides marijuana, trying to get custody back of her daughter. But Gabby stated that Lauren had relapsed once again and had a low tolerance for drugs. She had problems with heroin in the past, but Gabby and Victor, who was Lauren's mother's boyfriend, said she had started trying synthetic ecstasy or MDMA, which caused her severe strange symptoms. At the mental health facility, her toxicology report only showed THC and Suboxone, a common opioid blocker prescribed to treat opiate addiction. But they apparently didn't drug screen her until after 72 hours, and drugs such as ecstasy would not be detected after about 8 hours. Ecstasy works by prompting the brain to initiate this fight or flight response, and the user feels refreshed by a burst of energy. It can also distort your experience of reality by influencing perceptions of sight and sound. This could explain her recent erratic and concerning behavior. Not long after being released from the hospital the first time, she began having the same symptoms and was readmitted again for several days. The hospital discovered that she had a chemical imbalance from a recent procedure she had done at a clinic. Before that, she had no known history of mental health problems. When she was released from the hospital the second time, the day before she went missing, she spent the day applying for jobs. She applied at a local convenience store and was caught on surveillance camera leaving with the application. Her sister Cassie spoke to her about 6:30 that evening and said she sounded tired and stated She was worried that she would lose her job at Taco Bell for missing so many days while dealing with her mental health. This was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and her sister told her she would help her apply for unemployment the next day. 5 days after she disappeared, it was discovered once all her family became more heavily involved that a clerical error occurred when Gabby filed a missing persons report, which resulted in no one initially being assigned to her case. Lauren's purse was found by a homeless man on a table at the nearby Four Freedoms Park, the same purse she was carrying in the video surveillance while applying for jobs earlier. The park was located just a block from Lauren and Gabby's apartment. Four Freedoms Park is a place that Lauren often spent a lot of time meditating, and her mother lived across from it as well, and she often visited her. Divers entered the Bimini Basin to search for Lauren but found nothing. Within 2 days of her going missing, her family located what appeared to be pieces of her orange-painted artificial fingernails on the ground outside her apartment. The last text message she sent from her phone read, "You guys coming?" Lauren could only operate her phone via Wi-Fi, and she messaged through an app called TalkU or Facebook. This message was sent the night before Gabby said that he left her asleep in bed after 6 a.m. Friday morning to go to work. Investigators apparently know who the message was sent to but have not publicly released the name. On July 2, 2020, a shirt was discovered by the waterline at Four Freedoms Park. Lauren's family said it was one of her favorite shirts, and authorities noted it was odd since they had searched that area of the park several times and would have noticed it, so they believed that it was planted there. It also strangely was not very dirty and appeared to have just been put there. 2.5 weeks later, on July 20th, cadaver dogs were brought in to Four Freedoms Park. The dogs went straight across the street to Lauren's mother's home. Her mother lived there with her boyfriend Victor. Victor and Gabby worked together and both shared the work van that Victor owned, and at times Gabby used it and actually used it himself without Victor around the time Lauren went missing. The dogs alerted on that van right away. The dogs then went up the stairs to the apartment of Ann and Victor and hit on a curtain. The van and curtain were sent off for analysis. The van showed Lauren's DNA, but authorities said it was determined that the dogs may have hit on the van because it was used to transport old carpet from homes that someone could have died on, or for methane gas. Lauren also rode in the van often. Lauren's sister and father reported that Ann and Victor had not been helping in the search for Lauren in the weeks since she went missing and didn't show very much concern, but were definitely defending Gabby during this time. This caused a lot of tension between the two sides of Lauren's family. During the investigation, the maintenance man of Lauren's apartment complex stated that Lauren approached him about 8 a.m. the morning she went missing, 2 hours after Gabby left for work, and stated that she needed help finding an apartment so she could get out of a bad situation. There were other people in Lauren's life that have an extensive criminal record. She was involved with a man named Carl Crow that lived in the same apartment building as her. Crow has been in and out of jail for not only drug trafficking, but for covering up the overdose death of another young woman, Kaylu Masu of Cape Coral, just 2 months before Lauren went missing. Once she was discovered deceased in his house after days of partying, Crow and several others dumped her body instead of calling police because she wasn't the first person to overdose in his home. Although he was behind bars at the time Lauren went missing, his 2 acquaintances, Jose Rivera and Josh Acapel, were not, and both have lengthy criminal records as well. Josh lived near Lauren and claimed he saw her walking past his apartment about 10 a.m. the morning she went missing, and they had waved to one another. Another person of interest important to mention is a man named Shannon Ryan. Shannon is a self-proclaimed witch, and he ran a Facebook group known as Lightworkers of the World that Lauren and her mom frequently interacted with. He was arrested and charged with murdering Lila Cavett in Florida and leaving her 2-year-old son wandering alone at an apartment complex. Up until his arrest, all his Facebook posts on the Lightworkers of the World page were positive and inspiring, or about chakra and astral projecting, until all of a sudden they weren't. Instead, they became very threatening right before he was arrested. Lauren's mom died of COVID-19 while in the hospital fighting sepsis just a few months after Lauren went missing. For days later, Lauren's stepmom Tracy DeMallo passed away. Strangely, the day Lauren's mom was sent to the hospital after being found unresponsive in her bathroom, she had a visit from the same maintenance man that saw Lauren the morning she went missing. So he may have been the last person to see Lauren before she went missing, and the last person to see her mother and before she became deathly ill. It is of note that while hospitalized and barely responsive, she strangely mumbled his name, Michael. Turns out another twist exists. Michael, the maintenance man, and Gabby both previously lived 12 miles apart in Racine, Wisconsin. Although it could be a simple coincidence, they both ended up in Cape Coral, Florida, intertwined in the same missing persons case. As usual, law enforcement most likely has evidence that they just can't tell Lauren's family or the public about because it could hinder the investigation, which I imagine could be super frustrating to her loved ones. Lauren's father, Paul, along with her siblings and the rest of her family, have not given up hope of finding Lauren, and as of March 2022, this case remains unsolved. Brooke Samantha Cady was born in Billings, Montana on August 12, 1981. Brooke spent junior high and high school years in Laurel, Montana, and graduated in 1999. Brooke participated in multiple sports in school and would play in the summer softball league every year. She was just an all-around athletic person who lived a very healthy lifestyle. She loved the outdoors, and one of her favorite places was Yellowstone National Park. She was attending college and was enrolled in the paramedic program. She worked at Famous Staves for 7 years and continued working there while she was going to school. On December 31, 2009, she gave birth to a son she named Caden. The father of the child was Corey Alvarado, who she had met on a blind date 2 years earlier. After dating for a while, Brooke moved into Corey's house on Dry Gulch in Emerald Hills, Montana, which was across the street from his parents, Victor and Lori Alvarado's home. When Brooke went for her 6-week checkup after giving birth, the appointment went fine and she was healthy and doing very well. However, Brooke and Corey's relationship had taken a turn for the worse, and she was planning on taking Caden and moving back home. Not only had her and Corey's relationship become strained, she also did not get along with Corey's mother, Lori. In fact, she was downright scared of Lori. Then on March 8, 2010, Corey allegedly found Brooke in bed not breathing. Did he call 911? Yes, but allegedly only after calling his mother, Lori, first. Apparently, Brooke had been deceased in her bed for several hours. While an autopsy was inconclusive, it did reveal some chemicals in Brooke's tissue that are commonly found in oil fields. As it turns out, Corey had supposedly been working in the back in oil fields for an oil company and had been in the lab with chemicals. Strangely, Corey's family completely cleaned out the house immediately after the sheriff's department left and hauled everything to the dump, according to witnesses. Corey's mom then hired a defense attorney right away for him and allegedly refused to cooperate with the investigation. A rumor was spread that Brooke died of an infection caused by dental work, but according to her family, this is simply not true. Brooke's family states that Corey and his family have sadly refused to allow them to see Caden since her death. Corey has since remarried, and Brooke's family begs for him and Lori to speak with the investigator. Brooke's case is still open at Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department, and as of March 2022, this case remains unsolved. Megan Kristen Curl was born Megan Romero in 1973. In the year 2000, she was living in Lufkin, Texas in the Fox Run apartments. She was described as outgoing, kind, and fun-loving, and was diagnosed with a very mild mental disability in the 1st grade. Growing up, Megan was bullied because she was a little different. Her mother said she'd always come back with a kind word for them. As an adult, she was known to be naive and overly trusting of men. She married at the age of 18 and lived in Arkansas for several years, but would divorce because of abuse. Her mother, Sherry McClung, said that men often took advantage of her daughter, preying on her loneliness and vulnerability. She said that it was obvious to others that Megan wanted to be loved and accepted, and this made her an easy target as she was very outgoing. On the night of March 25, 2000, 26-year-old Megan was out dancing at a club called the Electric Cowboy. The bar was a place that she often went to and was known as a regular. But this night, she was seen talking to a man who other regulars would say was a new face in the bar that they'd never seen before. He was seen spending a lot of the night talking to Megan and buying her drinks. At some point that night, however, she was asked to leave because of her provocative dancing. She left the bar and went to a club called Sports Shack down the street from the Electric Cowboy. Megan was seen in Sports Shack talking to a number of people and then she was ready to go home, so she accepted a ride from one of the bar's employees. He dropped her off at her apartment building just after 1:30 a.m., where she then got into a conversation with a friend and fellow tenant in the building who had waited for Megan to get back. While the two women were talking about Megan's evening, the friend said that a car suddenly sped into the parking lot and came to an abrupt halt. Megan indicated that the driver was a man she'd met earlier, and the friend went back inside the apartment building. When she came back outside, she noticed the car was still there, but didn't see anyone in it or see Megan. Her friend then became worried and went upstairs and knocked on Megan's apartment door at 2:30 a.m. Megan answered and claimed to be fine, but the friend noticed that the driver of the car was inside the apartment. Megan's friend would say, she said, "I was right. It was my friend from the club. And I looked down to him and he just nodded his head slowly and didn't say a word. And I didn't speak to him at all either. I said, 'Well, are you sure you're okay?' And she said, 'Yes, I'm fine.'" Less than 2 hours later at 4 a.m. firefighters responded to a report of smoke and fire at the Fox Run Apartments. Inside apartment 616, Megan's apartment, they found Megan deceased, an obvious victim of a brutal homicide. Dental records were required to identify her. Her friend and neighbor that saw the man in Megan's apartment right before she was murdered was able to assist in a sketch being made of the suspect. He was a young white man with blonde hair and a baby face wearing gold-rimmed glasses and a mustache. Since Megan's murder, police have interviewed dozens of people and investigated several suspects. In 2012, a retiring Lufkin police officer stated that they believed they knew who killed Megan but didn't have enough evidence. At one point, the prime suspect was an ex-boyfriend of Megan's named Tim Purvis. Before she died, she had testified about him being abusive, which led to his parole being revoked. He was released from prison about 1 week prior to her murder. However, he had an alibi for that night. Tim died on June 19th after apparently falling off a water tower in Hudson, Texas. Witnesses say he fell off a water tower that had recently been completed and then refused medical treatment and was taken to his home where he later died in his sleep. It's been nearly 22 years since Megan's life was tragically cut short, and as of March 2022, this case remains unsolved. Tamara Jewel Keepens was born September 1, 1998, a twin to Tamara. She is of Aboriginal descent and was born to Troy and Lorena Keepens, who later divorced. She was a young white Bear Nations girl and described as loving, smart, and brave. She liked playing Mario Kart on Nintendo and climbing her favorite tree down the block from her house. At the age of 5, Tamara lived at 1834 Ottawa Street in a shabby brown and white two-story with a windowed porch at the front in Regina, Saskatchewan, and Canada. Many of the women and girls who lived or worked in the area were First Nations like Tamara. In the home also lived Tamara's mother, Lorena Kipnis, her mother's common law partner, Dean MacArthur, and her 5 siblings. The Kipnis home was less than a block from the Oksana Center halfway house for federal parolees. The house was also near Salvation Army's Waterston House, a shelter for former inmates and men struggling with addiction and mental health issues. A bar with a notorious reputation called the Earl Hotel was within walking distance of the home. The area was frequented by drug users and sex workers. Lorena and Dean struggled with addiction to drugs, and alcohol and domestic violence was prevalent in the home. Lorena herself grew up in a dysfunctional home with abuse and neglect, which rolled over into her adult life. After running away from White Bear Nation at the age of 14, she lived on the streets until the birth of her first daughter, Summer Wind, at the age of 20. She then had her son, Rain Dance, not long after. Then the twin girls, Tamara and Tamara. Since Lorena and Troy both struggled with substance abuse, their lives were sometimes too troubled and unstable to have the children with them. Once, the girls had arrived to Lorena's in the middle of the night after walking several blocks from their father Troy's home. Crisis and social workers received over 50 reports of abuse, neglect, and drug and alcohol use in the Kipnis home. Sadly, being around illegal activity and violence was also second nature to Tamara and her siblings. In 2004, had served 3 months in prison for brutally beating Lorena while drunk. Social services had been involved with the Kupnis family, and at least once the children were removed. Tamara was briefly cared for by loving foster mom and arrived showing signs of physical and possible sexual abuse. But the foster mom died of whooping cough and Tamara went back into the system and ultimately back at the home with Lorena and Dean. On July 5, 2004, Tamara and her 5 siblings were watching TV when Tamara went upstairs to go to sleep about 11 p.m. with her 2 brothers aged 3 and 10. Earlier in the night at around 8:30 p.m., Lorena and Dean, both drunk, got into an altercation, which they commonly did, and Dean left the house to go drink with a friend named Russell Sheepskin. Sheepskin often spent drunken nights in the house Tamara lived in, and on this particular night, his girlfriend had kicked him out. Dean and Sheepskin said they left to go buy a dime bag and baby formula. They stopped by the house to drop off the baby formula for Lorena and Dean's 9-month-old baby, then left again to go to a bar. They went to the St. Regis Hotel about 6 blocks away from the house. Sheepskin said he was so drunk he couldn't even remember dropping off the milk. He said he began blacking out at the park across from the hotel. Meanwhile, Lorena went to the store to buy alcohol and returned to tell her oldest child, 11-year-old Summer, to watch the other 5 children while she left to go to her friend's house a block away to drink. Lorena told Summer to keep the doors locked and not open them for anyone, and to call her if anything happened before leaving around midnight. Around 2 a.m. Sheepskin returned to the house, blackout drunk, made something to eat which he later didn't recall, and stated that he saw Tamara, Summer, and Tanis asleep in the living room. He and Dean had been drinking at a bar and then at a park before going their separate ways. When Dean arrived home, Sheepskin was smoking a cigarette on the front porch. A violent altercation then occurred between the 2 men. Dean brutally beat Sheepskin for unknown reasons, resulting in a broken window and blood on the porch. But it is highly speculated the reason for the altercation is because Sheepskin had harmed Tamara, although both men have insisted that the fight was unrelated to Tamara. After the fight, Sheepskin went out the back door, leaving it unlocked to walk to the hospital to get stitches, while Dean said he set off to sleep elsewhere. Dean stated that he had been headed to his aunt's house, which was several blocks away. However, it took him more than 2 hours to get there, and he says this is because he got lost and went to her old house before remembering she had moved. He claimed that he kept blacking out on the way there and had arrived at his aunt's house at 5:30 a.m. and passed out on her couch. Some people speculate that the 2 men were disposing of her body at this time. Soon after Sheepskin and Dean's altercation, Lorena arrived home after 3 a.m. heavily intoxicated and for some reason entered through a window then passed out on the couch. She later stated that she saw 2 of her children, Tanis and Summer, asleep in the living room, but she did not see Tamara. At 8 or 9 in the morning, Lorena woke up and opened the front door to let Summer and Rain out so they could walk to summer camp at a local rec center and let their grandmother Lois inside. Lorena then got back on the couch recovering from a bad hangover. At 10:30 a.m. Lois became concerned that Tamara had not come downstairs for breakfast, so she sent one of the other children to tell her to come eat. But Tamara was nowhere in the house. 8-year-old Rain said he had gone to bed squeezed into the space between the wall and mattresses piled on the floor in an upstairs bedroom. He told his mother he felt Tamara get up at some point and all he could remember was that it was light outside. If this is truly the case, that means Tamara didn't go missing until daylight, hours after Dean and Sheepskin left the house after the altercation. After 2 hours of searching for Tamara, her mother reported her missing. Hundreds of police and volunteers combed the neighborhood for any signs of Tamara. Nearly 13 hours had been unaccounted for between the last time Tamara had been seen by her mother and siblings and the time that she was reported missing. Some officers accompanied trained volunteer search teams and others questioned family members and potential witnesses going door to door, gathering leads or chasing down tips. The RCMP Training Academy provided cadets and members of the public soon began arriving on their own to help. Thousands of tips poured into police hotlines. Lorena and Dean provided authorities with the names of 5 people they thought might be suspects, including a pedophile who had befriended Tamara. Her mother was also suspicious of a woman nicknamed Big Auntie. She didn't know her real name, but she stayed at their house using different aliases and had lied about being pregnant. She apparently left the area around the same time that Tamara did and never returned. Tamara's father, Troy, was notified about his missing daughter and arrived very concerned. He returned to the house one night, weeks later, with a baseball bat and confronted Dane. Troy was ultimately charged with assault, though Dane later said that the police got things misunderstood. Immediately following her disappearance, police set up a command center bus in the parking lot of a nearby church. Much of the neighborhood was filled with overgrown yards, empty houses, and piles of garbage, an easy place to hide a small child. Searchers worked in grids, knocking on doors, inspecting old junk cars and garages, peering under discarded mattresses and piles of wood, and looking down manholes. The area in the neighborhood around Tamara's home reportedly had a foul odor following her disappearance. This is possibly due to the trash pickup being stopped by police while all the bins were checked during the middle of the summer, but some wonder if it was decomposition. Elders had told police they had visions of the child near rocks, water, and trees. However, no search has ever turned up with Tamara. After a week of searching, law enforcement began to interview local sex offenders and viewing CCTV footage from local bus stations and businesses. They determined that the multiple comings and goings from the house that night had not been fully explained. Tamara's 5 siblings were removed by social services due to the instability of the home. On July 19th, Dean was charged with assaulting Sheepskin on the night Tamara went missing and served 6 months in prison for it. A prison guard confessed to the police that she and a former inmate had stolen a van, kidnapped Tamara, and then burned the vehicle after disposing of the girl's body in a ravine on Moskow-Patong First Nation land. After a week-long search of the area, the guard admitted she had lied and had just been trying to get her abusive boyfriend locked up again. In 2014, a Reddit user with the name My Secret Is Out posted an eerie hand-drawn map of Moskow-Patong tribal land to the Regina subreddit, titled The Location of Tamara Cupney's Check the Wells. The user later stated that the map had been drawn by their late grandmother, who apparently had obtained the map from her sister in Alberta, who had visited someone in prison. The RCMP investigated a series of wells on Moskow-Patong land, but turned up no evidence and determined the lady was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Some believe that Tamara may have wandered from the house that night into the alley behind her house and was kidnapped from the streets. Sheepskin died January 1, 2009. Taking any details about what happened that night, and Dean and Lorena have maintained their innocence in Tamara's disappearance. Lorena has heard many theories about what happened to her daughter. She has repeatedly said that someone stole Tamara because she was so smart. Tamara's family members insist that she was taken from the house by a stranger that night. Some believe Tamara wandered away and was abducted by a driver cruising the area, or that she got lost then crawled in somewhere so small she has never been found. Other theories focus on the adults in the house that night. Some officers will say off the record that they think Tamara is in the dump, but they just couldn't find her due to the mountains of debris. The suggestion she could have had something to do with her daughter's disappearance still pushes Lorena to the point of violence. One night, she was at a bar and some women near Lorena began loudly saying to one another that she had sold her kid for dope. They were saying that she had all those babies so she could just sell them for drugs. Her friend told her not to listen, but Lorena couldn't ignore it and threatened the women. They met at the same bar again the next day, and that time they fought. One of them had a knife and slashed Lorena twice on the back of her arm. Another night, she was once again attacked in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Lorena and Dean remained on and off again for years following Tamara's disappearance. Sadly, she has never been found. No one has been arrested, and as of March 2022, this case remains unsolved. Susan Marie Nagersmith was born December 30th, 1969 to parents Marilyn and Kent Nagersmith of Carmel, New York. A cheerleader and competitive skier, she was known for her friendly and outgoing personality and as someone with lots of friends who enjoyed having fun. In 1990, at the age of 20, she had just finished her sophomore year at Westchester Community College, where she was majoring in marketing and made plans to go with 5 close friends to celebrate Memorial Day weekend in the shore town of Wildwood, New Jersey. The girls arrived in Wildwood around 1:30 a.m. on Saturday and rented a room at the Sonata Motel. They had some alcohol and marijuana, and Susan decided to leave the room about 9 p.m. and venture out by herself to see if anything exciting was going on in the area. Since Susan was only 20, she couldn't legally drink at any of the bars that line the streets of Wildwood. Those streets were filled with thousands of young adults who had come to the shore for the holiday weekend, and there were dozens of house parties in the area as well. With many of them spilling over into the streets, it didn't take long for Susan to find one that looked inviting, and she began partying with strangers. At some point during the evening, Susan ended up at a party at the JoJo Apartments on Maple Avenue, about 5 blocks away from the motel where she was staying. By the time she got there, she had already consumed a lot of alcohol and was clearly intoxicated. She was seen throwing up at least once, and witnesses recalled that she was having trouble standing. She was offered a ride back to her motel by at least one person who was concerned about her, but she declined. The next morning, May 27, 1990, her partially clothed body was found near dumpsters behind Schellingers, a restaurant located just 2 blocks from one of the busiest sections of the boardwalk where she was seen hours earlier. There was a bloody handprint on her chest and blood on her t-shirt, which along with her bra was pushed up around her neck. There was also blood found on other parts of her body, and she reportedly had a skull fracture. Her jeans were pulled down and twisted around her left ankle, and her tennis shoes were missing and her feet were clean, showing she hadn't walked without her shoes on. A witness would eventually come forward with information. This witness was a 20-year-old man who was visiting the shore from Philadelphia that had left the apartments around 2 a.m. with her. He later told police that he had attempted to escort her back to her hotel, but she was so drunk that she couldn't recall the name of her hotel, or where it was located. The man, who admitted that he had been drinking heavily as well, stated that he eventually gave up on Susan and went back to his own room. It was about 2:30 a.m. when he last saw her leaning against the wall of Schellingers' restaurant on Atlantic Avenue at the time. He said she was so intoxicated that she would have been incapable of consenting to sex. A toxicology report showed her blood alcohol content was 0.285. While this witness was one of the last people to see her alive, he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Detectives eventually managed to locate and interview a total of 107 people who had seen or spoken to Susan on the night in question. They administered polygraph examinations to 17 people, but all of them were eventually cleared of any involvement in Susan's death. Initially, her death was covered up and classified as accidental due to alcohol intoxication and exposure. It's said that it was ruled accidental because the town wanted to protect terrorism, and it's also said that the medical examiner, Dr. John Napoleon, was incompetent and unqualified for the job. They told the public that she was drunk and she had consensual sex behind the restaurant. And afterwards, she was too drunk to get up, and she froze to death in 57-degree weather. Dr. Napoleon's conclusion was that Susan's cause of death was lethal cardiac arrhythmia and hypothermia due to alcoholic intoxication and exposure. However, he explained away all the bruises on her body by claiming she had likely injured herself by falling down due to her level of intoxication. This lit a fire under her angry parents and local residents as well. Police could no longer conduct a homicide investigation despite the fact that many of them believed Susan had been murdered. A Seattle City resident named Terry Downey joined Susan's parents to attest to accidental ruling. She's also made a name for herself in Cape May County by questioning investigations into the deaths of several other women that occurred in recent years. Susan's parents hired attorneys and private investigators and fought a legal battle. Susan's father, Mr. Negersmith, also sought a second and third opinion from forensic pathologists who both reached the same conclusion. Susan was a homicide victim. The fight for justice had continued for 3 long years when a new prosecutor, Steve Moore, became the new Cape May County District Attorney. After reading the Negersmith's file, Moore reached the same conclusion as Susan's family. He lobbied state law enforcement officials, and an extensive review by the state police led them to the same finding: homicide. After a 3-year battle, her cause of death was changed to homicide after a world-renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, viewed autopsy photos and listed 26 points of trauma on Susan's body. But still, the original medical examiner refused to change her death certificate. It wasn't until 1995 when a new coroner, Dr. Elliot Gross, was appointed coroner and agreed to take another look at Susan's death. Dr. Gross examined Susan's larynx, which had been preserved, and found that it had fractures consistent with manual strangulation. In October 1995, the cause of death on Susan's death certificate was finally changed to homicide. An autopsy determined that she was sexually assaulted before her death and DNA from the assault was preserved. A profile was later created from the DNA, and in 2018, the Major Crimes Unit started a genetic genealogy analysis of the unknown DNA profile. Using genetic genealogy, genealogists and investigators were able to narrow it down to 62-year-old Jerry Rosado. Rosado then provided a buccal swab on May 26, 2021, exactly 31 years after the attack, to officially verify the match. He was later arrested 32 years after the murder, but has only been charged with second-degree crime of sexual assault. No murder charges have been filed in the case, but authorities say further charges could be made should additional information become available. He now faces 5 to 10 years if convicted of the sexual assault. 22-year-old Christine McWhorter and her aunt 31-year-old Beatrice Daniels were originally from the Philadelphia area of Pennsylvania and moved to Mount Union, Pennsylvania to get away from the city violence. The women lived in the Chestnut Terrace housing complex with Christine's 4-month-old daughter and 4-year-old son in Mount Union. Neighbors would report that on January 3, 2009, they heard yelling and commotion in the early morning hours. Later that same morning, Christine's 4-year-old son was able to finally get a neighbor's attention. That's when it was discovered that both women were found lying in their bed, shot to death. It's unknown how long the children were left alone with the bodies, but it's believed the murders occurred sometime between 9 p.m. on January 2nd and noon on January 3rd, which is when the 4-year-old got the attention of a neighbor. Droplets of blood were taken into evidence from the scene, and the initial DNA report concluded that the blood collected from the stairs and interior doors of the apartment were all deposited by an unidentified male. 7 years later, on March 14, 2016, Trooper David Clemens submitted DNA samples to DNA Solutions, which in turn prepared and forwarded the samples to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon performed phenotyping on a blood sample which narrowed the suspect down to a medium to light-skinned African-American male with green or hazel eyes and little to no freckles. On July 12, 2018, Parabon conducted a genetic genealogy analysis of the DNA recovered from the murder scene. 3 months later, they provided a report on the genetic genealogy of the DNA and identified Mariko Tyrone Johnson as a potential match. Johnson was interviewed over a year later at his home in Newport News, Virginia. He told investigators that he knew Christine through his then-girlfriend, Cynthia Swan, whom he dated from 2001 until 2012. The women were close friends, but Johnson denied having ever entered Christine's apartment. He provided his DNA to detectives, which was sent off to the state police lab in December 2019. The lab reported Johnson's DNA matched the blood evidence found on the stairs and interior doors of the crime scene. Investigators then compared Johnson's time card to the estimated time of the double murder. The complaint says that on January 22, 2020, state police received time cards from Johnson's then-employer, the New York Department of Corrections, which confirmed he was off of work on January 2, 2009, and started his January 3rd shift at 7 a.m. Police estimate the time it takes to travel the 294 miles between Mount Union and Johnson's thin workplace is 4 hours and 43 minutes. Police checked to see if Johnson had access to a .25 caliber firearm, the type used to kill Christine and Beatrice. His half-brother told troopers that he thought his late father owned a .25 caliber handgun and that Johnson inherited their father's belongings when he passed away in 1998. Johnson was then arrested on May 24, 2022 and charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide 13 years after the double murder. Investigators interviewed Johnson's ex-girlfriend, Cynthia, and learned that she was originally supposed to travel with Christine from Philadelphia to Mount Union on January 1, 2009 and stay for the weekend, but decided at the last minute to remain in Philadelphia with a man, Benjamin June. Cynthia told the troopers it was around this time that Johnson found out that Cynthia was having an affair with June. Police say the last incoming text on Christine's cell phone was from Cynthia, asking Christine to call her, and it was important, but she never responded to the text. Johnson remains behind bars with an upcoming trial, but has spent the last 13 years enjoying his freedom. Kara Nancy Nichols was born on May 20th, 1993 to parents Julia and Paul Nichols. She grew up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with an older brother and a younger sister. During her sophomore year of high school, Kara fell into depression when her family dog died. Her parents tried to get her to go to counseling, but Kara refused and didn't take her prescribed medication. Instead, Kara started using drugs and became rebellious and manic and was most likely struggling with an untreated mental illness. She attended Rampart High School in Colorado Springs and later graduated from local alternative high school Life Skills of Colorado Springs, where she could work at her own pace. After graduation, Kara began waitressing and modeling part-time, mostly lingerie shoes. She also created a profile on Model Mayhem, an online modeling website that links models with photographers. In the summer of 2012, Kara quit her job and moved with her family to Chicago, Illinois. Her drug abuse worsened and her family enrolled her in a drug treatment program, but she was discharged early when she didn't follow the rules. In August of 2012, Kara moved back to Colorado Springs on her own. She lived in a home with 3 male roommates in the 6700 block of Mission Road in the Cimarron Hills area of Colorado Springs. A couple months later, on October 9, 2012, she told her roommate that she would be traveling from Colorado Springs to Denver for a photo shoot job. When she left, she was picked up by someone in a dark sedan. Her brother Terrence last spoke to her at almost midnight that night, and she said she was on her way to Denver for a modeling assignment. 2 days later, Kara's parents reported her missing when she didn't return. On November 30th, 2012, a profile featuring photos of Kara appeared on My Red Book, which is an online Las Vegas escort website. When police called the number, her family said the voice was not hers. Authorities eventually concluded that the photos were taken from another source and that Kara was not in Las Vegas. And escort websites often use random pictures lifted from the internet to advertise online. Months later, police learned she had actually been working as an escort and had placed an ad wearing lingerie on a classified ad website at 7:28 p.m. the night she disappeared. Kara's cell phone records revealed she made 8 calls on October 9, 2012 between 9:58 p.m. and 11:08 p.m. and that she last used her phone at 11:59 p.m. On May 8, 2013, the detective finally received a return call from a man who identified himself as Joel Hollendorfer. When asked if the phone belonged to Hollendorfer, he said yes. The detective said he was investigating a missing person case and his number was on the list of records from the night she disappeared. Hollendorfer said he was seeking escort services that night and answered Kara's ad, saying they spoke several times that night, but he was looking to go to her, but she only went to locations. Hollendorfer went on to say that they never met that night. Investigations volunteer Mark Oldfield was able to track Kara's phone movements the night of October 9th to its last known usage in the early hours of October 10th, 2012. Mark was able to determine that Kara left her house at approximately 11:16 p.m. and traveled the route that led directly toward Burgess Road, where Hollendorfer's family owned a farm. Further details revealed 6 calls and texts were sent and received from 11:34 p.m. to 11:41 p.m. coming off Woodsman Tower. Based on Kara's phone activity, her phone was at the intersection of Woodman and Black Forest Road at 11:33 p.m. Based on the last known activity from Kira's phone, it led them to 9665 Burgess Road. Detective Gigliotta obtained a search warrant for the address on October 2, 2014, a year after she went missing. Multiple agencies participated in the search, including cadaver dogs. Hollendorfer's mother, Betty, walked the property with members from the search team and pointed out numerous locations where animals may be buried since purchasing the property in 1985. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property and ground-penetrating radar was used to determine spots that had been disturbed. But instead of excavating the spots, they did what Betty suggested. They searched the property across the street at 11,660 Greenacres Lane, which her son also had access to. Cadaver dogs narrowed in on a shallow grave which was excavated, and it was apparent that roots were dug up at the site and a hole had been dug to about the size of a human body, but no human remains were found. For reasons that are not explained in the affidavit, none of the other areas the dogs hid on were excavated, leading to the question, why bring cadaver dogs to a property and not dig when they hid on certain areas? Turns out, Betty was protecting her son, and if they would have excavated the areas across the street that the dogs hid on, they would have found what they were looking for. During an interview that same month, Hollendorfer admitted to looking up Kara online, wanting to meet her and communicating with her. He said Kara never met him at the location that she was supposed to, and he never ended up meeting her. He added that he had been heavily involved with escorts and drugs, which he says is why his marriage ended. During the initial investigation, Detective Giulietta attempted to reach Hollendorfer's wife Christina, but she wouldn't cooperate with the initial investigation and never made a statement. However, on February 1, 2022, 10 years after Kara's disappearance, FBI special agents interviewed Christina. Turns out, she had been keeping a huge secret for 8 years, until investigators tracked her down to Virginia and knocked on her door. Now known as Christina Palmer, she stated that after Hollendorfer's father died in November 2014, he admitted to her that he accidentally killed an escort he hired and buried her body on top of an old horse grave on his parents during the interview. Christina stated that Hollendorfer said that he accidentally strangled Kara to death and then buried her on an old horse grave with plastic bags and lime. She also told detectives that Hollendorfer said he told his parents what he did and that he believed it had driven his father to his grave. Based on the information she provided, on February 7, 2022, a search warrant was obtained and a team of El Paso County Sheriff's Office detectives and specialists, alongside the FBI Evidence Response Team, were deployed to the 9600 block of Burgess Road. Police zeroed in on a spot where his mother said her favorite horse Milo was buried. 3 feet down, they found a garbage bag, a human hand, and more remains. Hollendorfer was then arrested days later on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence, ending a 10-year mystery that could have ended 9 years earlier. During a court appearance on February 17, 2022, Hollendorfer's charge was upgraded from second to first-degree murder, and his bond was revoked based on the autopsy results. Kara's family has long maintained that the El Paso County Sheriff's Department botched the initial investigation, and the sheriff, Terry McKetta, was run out of office amid allegations of misconduct in 2014. Some describe McKetta's term in Colorado Springs as similar to living in the Wild West. Many describe former Sheriff McKetta as very corrupt. He allegedly led an incredibly corrupt department and was involved with multiple women in the department, giving them lavish raises and spending department funds on romantic vacations with them. He would also allegedly punish or fire the women who wouldn't sleep with him. He also allegedly had a hit list of people he intended to kill. At the same time, one officer was running an extensive Ponzi scheme in the department. David Hawkins had collected around $300,000 in cash from fellow deputies and even their families, but never invested it and was eventually convicted and sent to prison. The allegations against McKetta were already years old at that point, but he couldn't be forced to resign because of some technicality. McKetta also mismanaged the investigation into the devastating Black Forest fire. In the summer of 2021, less than a year before Kara's body was discovered, several local area residents became concerned about the condition of 2 horses on the Hollendorfer's property, Meadowview Farm. The El Paso County Sheriff's Office investigated and had a veterinarian and a horse rescue come to the site. Unfortunately, both horses had to be euthanized because they were so starved they could not be saved. It's unclear what, if any, charges were filed against the Hollendorfers. I'm sure they were likely more concerned about law enforcement being so close to Kara's grave at the time. Her parents were in disbelief 2 years after their daughter went missing over a recording released by the El Paso County Sheriff's Office that suggests the initial investigator brushed off the case. In the 50-minute recording, Patrol Deputy Cliff Porter is confronted by his superiors about statements he made in Kara's case. Porter was taken off the case after a couple of months, but he came under fire after statements he made to his replacement were reported to his superiors. He repeated those statements in a meeting as well. This is what he said. I said, maybe somebody would finally just say, look, this is a cold case. This girl is probably dead. We're going to work the leads, but we're going to shelve this thing. We won't overreact every time Mr. Nichols comes in. Kira's mother stated that in the first few weeks, they were wondering why Officer Porter wouldn't respond to their calls. And when he did, he seemed very cynical, very negative about the possibility of finding their daughter alive. She stated, "You just wonder what else has gone on. You wonder how many other victims have been treated like this. It just re-victimized a family who's already suffering. 34-year-old Rita Gutierrez Garcia was born April 7, 1983, and was described as an attentive and compassionate mother of her 3 boys. On March 17, 2018, she went out with friends to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. After spending time at the Speakeasy and Breakers Grill on Main Street in Longmont, Colorado, she and friends went through the alleyway to the parking lot behind Three's Bar to leave. Rita was on the phone with someone at 2:30 a.m. when she told her friends she was getting a ride with someone else, and so they left. Sadly, this is the last time they would see her alive. Later, her mom arrived at Rita's home on Sunday to take her 18, 13, and 9-year-old grandsons to church. That's when the grandmother learned her daughter was missing, and after an exhaustive search for her, they reported her missing the following day. Early on in the investigation, Juan Figueroa was identified as a possible suspect in her disappearance. Several witnesses also reported that he had interacted with Rita inside the bar about 1:30 a.m. and was seen outside of the bar near her about an hour later. A security camera captured Figueroa's truck traveling through that exact same area at 3:03 a.m. Cell phone data from Rita's phone placed her phone near the 600 block between Main Street and Kaufman Street between 2:40 a.m. to 03:03 a.m. on the morning she was last seen. 4 minutes later, 2 911 call hang-ups were made from Rita's phone. Her phone dropped off the network at 3:10 a.m. and was in the area of 3rd Avenue and Vivian Street in Longmont at that time. Rita was missing, and evidence pointed to one person responsible for her disappearance. That was Figueroa. Figueroa left Colorado 2 days after Rita went missing after police attempted to contact him at his mother's home in regards to her disappearance. He was briefly in Texas, but later crossed the border into Mexico. While in Mexico, he asked several people for money and said he was in trouble and that he planned to sell his truck. He tried to re-enter the U.S. and was arrested on March 27, 2018 on a warrant for a separate sexual assault and attempted murder of a woman a year earlier, for which he was later convicted and sentenced to 93 years to life. While behind bars, he told a cellmate that he strangled the missing woman and disposed of her body before returning to his sister's house. He also told that cellmate, according to the indictment, that she had called him a weirdo, which caused him to punch her, knocking her unconscious. After that, he strangled her to death. Prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury in April 2021 as a no-body homicide, as DNA evidence and cell phone data linked him to her presumed murder. 2 months later, the grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder and kidnapping in Rita's case. In court, he admitted to knocking her unconscious, dragging her to his vehicle, and strangling her. He said he believed he was insane that night and snapped when she called him a weirdo. As part of a plea deal, Figueroa led investigators to the location of Rita's body. She was recovered in an area of northern Colorado's Weld County on April 28, 2022. Figueroa pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. He was immediately sentenced to 48 years in prison. The sentences will be served concurrently along with the 93-year sentence he's already serving for the unrelated case of kidnapping and attempted murder of another victim. Clifford Bernhard served his country as an Army sergeant in the Vietnam War and was ultimately awarded a Purple Heart. After serving in the Army, he began working as a construction worker. On June 7, 1969, he would marry his high school sweetheart, Linda Reich. The couple was very much in love and very well liked by all that knew them. On November 6, 1973, the 24-year-olds were still settling into their new ranch-style home at 1116 Dorothy Lane near the Yellowstone River in Billings, Montana. They had planned to go have dinner at Linda's parents' house around the corner, but they decided to cancel. Linda called her mother June Reich and told her they planned on staying in for the night instead. The two enjoyed a hamburger casserole that Linda had whipped up for them. The next morning, when Linda didn't show up for work, her mother went to check on the couple and came upon a horrifying scene. She found the couple tragically and brutally murdered. Cliff was found lying face down in the master bedroom with a severe wound to his head. Cliff and Linda had both been strangled to death, and Linda had been sexually assaulted and left naked on the floor of another bedroom. There were also signs that both were bound at the wrist and ankles at some point. Strangely and possibly from the shock of it all, while waiting for law enforcement to arrive, Linda's mother cleaned up the dishes which disturbed the crime scene. She stated that it appeared to her that before doing the dishes that the table may have been set for 3 people. The killer had opened up windows in both bedrooms the bodies were found in and turned the furnace down all the way. The lowest temperature that night was 6 degrees, making it cold enough for a bowl of ice cubes found next to Linda's body to remain frozen. It's unknown what the bowl of ice next to her body was for, but possibly used during the sexual assault. Missing from the house was all of Linda's panties, some of her shoes, and her green suitcase. With no signs of forced entry, investigators speculated that they knew their killer and had willingly let them in. Also, the murder may have been premeditated as he brought his own leather bindings. The crime devastated the Bernhard and Reich families, and left a void in the lives of all who knew Linda and Clifford. Over many years, about 80 DNA samples were collected from persons of interest, but none were a match. In 2004, there was a huge break in the case when DNA was discovered on Linda's purple pants. It was entered into Cody's, but there was no matches. Then in 2012, a cold case unit became obsessed with finding the killer in the following year. An anonymous donor offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to a conviction. In 2015, the county hired Parabon to analyze the DNA and created a composite predicting the suspect's ethnicity, hair, and eye color and complexion. A few years later, in 2018, when forensic genetic genealogy was fully blossoming, genealogists were working tirelessly to pinpoint who the DNA belonged to. Finally, on January 3, 2019, Parabon determined the suspect was one of 2 brothers. Unfortunately, one of those brothers had died, and so investigators obtained DNA from the one living and were able to rule him out, which means the DNA could only belong to one individual. 45 years after Linda and Cliff's deaths, authorities announced the suspect, Cecil Stan Caldwell, a former co-worker of Linda's at a grocery store warehouse. Linda worked in billing and secretarial work, while Caldwell worked in the warehouse and meat department. He was also a father of 2 adopted children and 2 stepchildren and had no criminal history. Unfortunately, in 2003, he died in Billings at the age of 59 and never faced justice. Caldwell had no arrest record, and authorities likely will never know the true motive for the slayings. Former Deputy Dean Mellum, who worked on the case in 1973, said he hopes the news will at least give some comfort to the couple's families. In July 1981, a 24-year-old woman went missing in Birmingham, England. With limited forensic tools at the time, the case went cold until a breakthrough came decades later. Nova Welsh was born in Jamaica in 1957. When Nova turned 10, her mother, Lorna, made the difficult decision to move to the United Kingdom with her 2 daughters. Lorna wanted to give her girls a better life and more opportunities, even though it meant leaving behind the familiarity and comfort of their home in Jamaica. At the age of 16, Nova met Osmond Bell, a young man who quickly captured her heart. Their connection was immediate, and despite their youth, they decided to take their relationship seriously. They made the bold choice to live together. Their love seemed strong in the beginning, and 2 years later, they welcomed their first child, Jonathan. For years after Jonathan's birth, they had another son, whom they named Lee. The family appeared happy to the outside world, and Nova took great pride in being a mother. However, beneath the surface, their relationship began to deteriorate. The affection and connection they once shared slowly faded away, replaced by tension and resentment. Arguments became more frequent, and soon domestic violence entered their home. Osmond reportedly began physically abusing Nova, controlling her movements, and threatening her life if she ever tried to leave. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly volatile, leaving Nova emotionally drained and fearful for her safety. Unable to carry the burden alone, Nova confided in her younger sister, sharing the pain and fear she endured. She expressed how unhappy she had become and how much she longed for peace. Eventually, Nova decided she could no longer live under such circumstances. She ended her relationship with Osmond, determined to find happiness again. After some time, Nova met a man named Wayne Newby. Hoping to start fresh, she allowed herself to fall in love again. Wayne began visiting her home, and their relationship blossomed into something that gave her hope. But this new chapter in her life angered Osmond deeply. His jealousy and violent behavior worsened, and Nova found herself once again surrounded by danger, unaware that an even darker fate awaited her. On July 27, 1981, failed to show up for work. Days went by, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Her disappearance was sudden and without explanation. It was Nova's best friend who first noticed something was wrong. She called Nova several times, hoping to hear her familiar voice, but every call went unanswered. Growing uneasy, she decided to go to Nova's apartment to check on her personally. When she arrived at the apartment, she found the door locked. She knocked several times, calling out Nova's name, but there was no response. The silence inside was unsettling. At first, she thought perhaps Nova had traveled abroad without telling anyone, but something did not add up. Hanging on the clothesline outside were freshly washed clothes, an odd detail that made her realize something was terribly wrong. On August 9th, unable to shake her worry, she went to the police station and officially reported Nova missing. 2 weeks after Nova's disappearance, the police began a formal search. They reached out to Osmond Bell, hoping he could provide information about her whereabouts. Osmond claimed that he had not seen Nova in days and suggested that she might have left for America with her new boyfriend, Wayne. Meanwhile, Nova's 2 sons were staying with him, unaware of the tragedy that was unfolding. Then, 3 days after the missing person report was filed, a strange letter surfaced. It was handed to Nova's best friend, who quickly turned it over to the police. The handwriting appeared to belong to a woman, but the identity of the writer was unknown. On August 18th, a neighbor called the police to report a strong, foul odor that had begun spreading through the area. The smell seemed to be coming from Nova's apartment upstairs. Responding officers broke the lock and entered the home to investigate. The stench was overpowering, leading them to a cupboard located under the stairs. The door to the cupboard was locked, but the lock appeared to have been tampered with. A piece of chewing gum was oddly used to keep it sealed. When the officers finally opened the cupboard, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was the decomposing body of a woman wrapped in a blanket. The body was soon identified as belonging to Nova. She was wearing a nightgown, and despite the state of decay, her features were still recognizable. The scene was heartbreaking and disturbing. The police immediately called for an ambulance, and Nova's body was taken for an autopsy. According to the post-mortem report, she had lost her life due to pressure applied to her neck, indicating that she had been strangled. The piece of chewing gum from the cupboard lock was carefully collected as evidence. While the world searched for Nova, she had been lying lifeless inside her own home. Osmond emerged as the prime suspect. He was arrested and held in custody for 4 days, during which he was questioned repeatedly about Nova's demise. Osmond maintained his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with it. With no solid evidence linking him directly to the case, the police were forced to release him. The investigation continued for some time, but with no new leads or breakthroughs, the case eventually went cold. In 2016, cold case investigators began reviewing older unsolved cases, hoping that advancements in forensic science might finally bring long-awaited answers. Among these cases was the tragic case of Nova, whose end had remained a haunting mystery for more than 3 decades. By this time, genetic testing had advanced significantly since the 1980s, offering new possibilities for uncovering evidence that had once seemed useless. The investigators revisited the materials collected from the original crime scene, determined to find something that could point to the perpetrator. During their review, the investigators made a crucial discovery. DNA testing on the piece of chewing gum used to seal the cupboard door where Nova's body was found revealed a match to Osmond Bell. The same DNA profile was also identified on the anonymous letter that had been sent to Nova's best friend, an attempt to shift suspicion toward Wayne, the man Nova had recently begun dating. The DNA evidence was described as having a 1,000,000 to 1 chance of belonging to anyone else, leaving no doubt about the connection. Following the discovery, Bell was arrested in 2016 and charged in connection with Nova's demise. After years of waiting, the case finally went to trial at Birmingham Crown Court in 2017. The The court heard that Bell had ended Nova's life in a fit of rage after learning about her new relationship. The prosecutors explained that in the aftermath of the crime, he had tried to mislead the investigators by sending a forged letter, pretending to be someone else, and suggesting that Wayne was responsible. The details painted a picture of a jealous and violent man desperate to conceal his guilt. Testimony during the trial revealed that Nova and Bell had continued living together even after their separation, but their relationship had become deeply toxic. Witnesses recounted how Bell had repeatedly threatened to end Nova's life if she ever left him. This threat, once dismissed as an angry outburst, took on a chilling weight as the evidence unfolded. Despite the prosecution's efforts, the jury found Bell guilty of manslaughter, concluding that he had not planned the crime but acted in anger. In March 2017, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. After 36 long years, justice had finally been served. Nova's mother Lorna expressed a deep sense of relief and sorrow as she gave her statement to the press. She said, "Finally, after 36 long years, Nova can rest in peace. The family can now have closure knowing the person who took Nova's life has been brought to justice. I would sincerely like to thank everyone involved in bringing this case to court." A police officer who had worked on the case also reflected on its significance. He stated, "With the advances in technology assisting our old investigations, we can bring people to justice no matter how long after the offense has happened." In August 1660, a 70-year-old man set out on a short walk in Campden, England, and never returned. With no body and mounting suspicion, the disappearance spiraled into one of the most shocking criminal cases of the 17th century. William Harrison was born around the year 1590. As an adult, William entered into service under Lady Campden, where he worked as a steward and estate manager. This position placed him in charge of overseeing the smooth running of her lands and financial affairs, a role that demanded both precision and honesty. Within the community, William was known as a man of strong moral standing. His work often required him to travel, collect rents, and mediate disputes between tenants, tasks that could easily lead to mistrust or resentment if handled poorly. By the year 1660, William was nearing 70 years old, an age when most would have retired from demanding responsibilities. Nevertheless, he continued to fulfill his role with the same diligence he had shown throughout his life. He lived in Campden with his wife and son, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of village life. On August 16, 1660, William set out on foot to collect rents in the nearby village of Charingworth, a journey of about 2 miles from his home. It was a routine task, one he had undertaken many times before without incident. However, that evening, William failed to return home. His wife, increasingly anxious as darkness fell, sent the family servant, John Perry, to look for him along the familiar path. When John did not return by the following morning, William's son Edward joined the search, determined to uncover what had happened to his father. Their search led to a disturbing discovery. Along the route to Charingworth, they found a hat, a shirt, and a neckband belonging to William. The garments were stained with blood, and the hat appeared to have been slashed with a sharp instrument. To those who knew William's habits and cautious nature, it seemed clear that something terrible had occurred. With no sign of his body and only these bloodied remnants, the community feared the worst. Rumors spread quickly through Campden that William's life was ended during his journey. Suspicion soon turned toward John Perry, the servant who had been sent to find his master. Under questioning, John offered a shocking confession. He claimed that he, his mother Joan Perry, and his brother Richard had conspired to rob and slain William. According to his account, they had strangled the elderly steward and dumped his body in a mill pond to conceal their crime. Despite the absence of a body, the confession seemed convincing enough to the local authorities, and all 3 members of the Perry family were arrested and charged. The first trial took place in 1661. During the proceedings, inconsistencies emerged in John's statements, including a false story he had told weeks earlier about being attacked by robbers. His testimony implicated his mother and brother, leading to their conviction for robbery, though no conclusive evidence of slaying was presented. It is believed that Joan and Richard guilty to robbery in hopes of benefiting from the Indemnity and Oblivion Act of 1660, which pardoned certain first-time offenders. Still, questions about the missing body and the truth of John's account lingered. A second trial was convened later that spring, this time charging the Perrys with taking the life of William. By then, John had recanted his earlier confession, claiming that his words were the product of confusion or insanity. Nevertheless, the jury remained unconvinced. Despite the absence of physical proof and John's reversal, all three were found guilty and received capital punishment. The verdict was met with both disbelief and grim acceptance among the townspeople. The executions were carried out on Broadway Hill in Gloucestershire. Joan Perry was hanged first, reportedly in an attempt to break any supposed witchcraft spell she might have cast over her sons. Her execution was followed by that of Richard and John, who both maintained their innocence until the end. 2 years after his mysterious disappearance, in 1662, William astonished everyone by returning to England alive. He was older, frail, and marked by the hardships he had endured, yet unmistakably the same William who had vanished on his journey to Charingworth. According to William's own account, he had been kidnapped on the night of his disappearance by 3 horsemen. They had seized him on the road and carried him off against his will, taking him first to the coastal town of Deal. There he claimed he was sold to a ship's captain and transported overseas. His story grew even more extraordinary as he described being sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Forced into servitude, he lived under harsh conditions until the demise of his master provided him with a chance to escape. After his escape, William said he made his way to a seaport, where he managed to stow away on a Portuguese vessel. The ship carried him to Lisbon, where he found temporary refuge before finally securing passage back to England. His return journey was long and dangerous, and it was only after many months that he was able to reach his homeland once more. When he arrived, he was welcomed by astonished neighbors and a deeply shaken family who had mourned him. The revelation that William was alive cast a grim light on the events that had followed his disappearance. The executions of Joan, John, and Richard Perry appeared to be an appalling miscarriage of justice. They had been tried, convicted, and hanged for a crime that had never occurred, their ends resting entirely on John's false confession. The case became one of the most disturbing examples of wrongful conviction in English legal history, raising troubling questions about the reliability of confessions made under pressure. In May 1987, in Hopkins, South Carolina, 2 hunters stumbled upon a horrifying scene of human remains. With limited forensic tools available at the time, the case quickly went cold, leaving her family without answers until decades later. Patricia Ann Green was born in 1953. She grew up to become a devoted mother who dedicated much of her time and energy to raising her 3 children. By 1987, Patricia was raising her family in Columbia, South Carolina. At that time, she lived with her 3 children and her sister in an apartment located on Rice Street, just off Pickens Street. On May 10, 1987, a shocking discovery was made just steps away from the entrance of McEntire Air Base in Hopkins, South Carolina. 2 hunters, moving through the area, came across a disturbing sight. What they found would remain with them forever, and in their horror, they quickly contacted law enforcement to report what they had seen. When the police arrived at the scene, they confirmed the hunters' worst fears. The victim was a woman, already deceased. The officers carefully surveyed the area and determined that the woman had been shot multiple times before being left in a culvert. The investigators began piecing together what they could from the scene. They worked to understand how the victim ended up in such a remote and hidden location. While searching the immediate area, the officers noted a small but haunting detail. The woman's shoes were not on her feet. Instead, her untied shoes were found lying nearby on the bank of the ditch, separated from her body. One of the first challenges the authorities were facing was identifying the victim. No identification was recovered at the scene. With no personal belongings or immediate clues at the crime scene, the investigators decided to circulate details of the case locally in the hope that someone might recognize her. Eventually, Family members came forward and confirmed the victim was Patricia and Green. Years passed without justice, but in the 2000s and 2010s, a new effort emerged. Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott established a cold case squad dedicated to revisiting unsolved cases. This specialized team began reviewing old cases with fresh eyes, determined to apply modern technology to evidence that had once yielded no results. Patricia's case was among those re-examined. The detectives returned to the evidence collected from the crime scene decades earlier. With advances in technology, samples were retested. The new analysis provided investigators with a crucial breakthrough. The DNA results pointed directly to Philip Johnson, a man already serving multiple life sentences in Sumter County. Johnson had been arrested in 1988 and was known for a string of violent crimes. In March 2017, when the investigators confronted him, he offered details about the crime that only the perpetrator could have known. According to his own account, Johnson admitted that Patricia's slaying was part of a spree. He told the investigators there was no specific motive, describing her as simply somebody that he shot and slain. The authorities believe that he ended 2 women's lives in Sumter County before he ended Patricia's life, and then went on to take the lives of 2 more women afterward. Johnson remains incarcerated at Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Reflecting on the case, law enforcement emphasized the importance of persistence. The authorities stated that this case serves as a reminder to victims' families that they are never forgotten. Cold case investigators pledged that no matter how much time passes, they will continue to review old files with the latest technology available. For Patricia's family, the wait for answers stretched nearly 30 years, but with the confession and DNA confirmation, they finally received the truth about what happened to her. In July 2011, a 16-year-old girl left her home in La Paz, Mendoza province in Argentina, but she never returned. What began as a missing person report quickly unraveled into a web of contradictions, silence, and overlooked evidence. Aldana Celeste Orozco Maturano was born in 1997 in La Paz. She grew up in modest circumstances, raised mainly by her mother and stepfather. By 2011, Aldana was in her second year of high school and had begun to develop her own opinions and dreams. Like many teenagers, she was curious about the world beyond her small town. She expressed a desire for independence and talked about finding a way to build a better future for herself and her family. Her teachers saw her as a thoughtful student who worked hard and rarely got into trouble. On July 8th, Aldana was last seen leaving her home, reportedly to visit a friend. It was a normal afternoon and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, Aldana never returned home. As hours turned into days, her family grew increasingly anxious, and what began as mild concern soon turned into panic. When all attempts to locate her failed, they decided to file a missing person report with the local authorities. The initial investigation offered little clarity. The statements given to the police were inconsistent and confusing. Aldana's stepfather told the officers that she had been acting rebellious and suggested that she might have left voluntarily. His account implied that she had run away in search of freedom or independence. But this explanation did not align with what others knew about her. Aldana's friends and classmates rejected the runaway theory. They insisted that she had no boyfriend, no savings, and no plans to leave home. She had shown no signs of distress and had even made plans for school activities later that week. To them, it was unthinkable that she would vanish without telling anyone. These contradictions deepened the mystery surrounding her disappearance, but the investigators appeared reluctant to dig deeper. Within weeks, the case lost momentum. The police treated Aldana's disappearance as a runaway incident rather than a possible kidnapping, which limited the resources and urgency devoted to finding her. No search teams were organized and no public alerts were issued. For the family, this lack of action was devastating as every passing day made hope feel more distant. In the months that followed, the neighbors began recalling troubling details from before Aldana went missing. Several reported hearing loud arguments and shouting coming from her home in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Some witnesses also claimed that they had seen unknown men visiting the house at odd hours, raising suspicions about possible connections to trafficking or criminal activity. Despite these disturbing accounts, the authorities failed to follow up on key leads. Testimonies were overlooked, and evidence was never properly examined. As a result, Aldana's case gradually faded from public attention. What began as a missing person investigation soon turned into a cold case, leaving behind unanswered questions. Over the years, her face appeared on missing children campaigns and Interpol databases, keeping her name alive long after the local authorities had closed the file. Activists and independent organizations often cited her case as a symbol of the failures in Argentina's handling of missing person investigations, especially those involving minors from low-income families. For nearly a decade, her family lived between faint hope and painful uncertainty, never knowing whether Aldana was alive or deceased. In December 2020, the long-dormant case suddenly resurfaced when the National Gendarmerie conducted a raid on the home of Aldana's mother and stepfather. The operation led to both being arrested and detained on suspicion of involvement in human trafficking. The investigators alleged that Aldana's disappearance might have been connected to a broader criminal network that operated by recruiting or coercing minors through family members. Following the arrests, the federal court expanded its investigation into a suspected child trafficking network that allegedly involved the exchange or sale of minors. The authorities began uncovering evidence suggesting that vulnerable families had been targeted by traffickers who promised money, favors, or opportunities in return for handing over children. These revelations painted a grim picture of systemic exploitation that had remained hidden in plain sight for years. Then, in 2021, nearly 10 years after she first vanished, Aldana was found alive in Buenos Aires during a police operation against a human trafficking ring. Aldana had been forced into prostitution from a young age and lived under the constant control of her captors. Her years in captivity were marked by abuse, coercion, and the loss of freedom she had once dreamed of gaining. Her recovery brought renewed national attention and forced Argentina to confront deep-rooted issues within its justice system. Journalists, activists, and citizens began questioning how such a case could have gone unnoticed for so long, and why early warnings had been dismissed. The public outcry demanded accountability for the neglect and corruption that had allowed Aldana's suffering to continue unchecked.